So here in this route handler, we have this try catch block. The problem with this implementation is that we have to repeat this try catch block in every route handler. And also, this is adding extra noise to the code and it's distracting us from the actual logic that belongs to this route handler. So ideally, we should move this high-level code somewhere else to a single function. Something like this. Let me show you. So let's define a function. Let's call this async middleware. And later you will know why I chose this name. So this function should have a template like this. So here we have the try block. We're going to execute some code here, and this code will vary from one route handler to another. Then we have the catch block that takes an exception. And here we simply call next with this exception. So this is the template that we want to have in every route handler. The part that is different is only this part. So what if we pass a function as an argument here? That is our route handler function. Then we can call that here. So with this, we can simplify the code in this route handler. We no longer need the try block, the catch block, and the next parameter. Now look at this async function, this anonymous function that we're passing as a route handler. So this is an async function, and eventually we want to pass this function as an argument to this new function. Now, because handler is an async function, we should await it. And because we have used await here, we should also mark this function as async. Okay. Now here, as a second argument to the get method, we want to call async middleware and pass this anonymous function as an argument, which we call handler. So let's call async middleware. We pass an argument, which is an anonymous async function. Now there is a tiny issue here. Here in the try block, this handler that we are calling needs two arguments, the request and the response. So look, this anonymous function is our handler, right? And this function has two parameters, request and response. So when calling it, we should pass the request and the response objects here. Now the issue we have here is that nowhere in this async middleware function we have defined request, response, and next. The only parameter in this function is a reference to another function which we call handler. So how do we get access to these three objects? Well, before I tell you how we get access to these objects, we need to look at a deeper issue. In the current implementation, we are calling async middleware function and passing this handler as an argument. So we're calling this function here. However, when defining an express route, we are not going to call our middleware or route handler functions. We simply pass a reference to a function. Let me clarify. So here I'm going to define another route, router.get, let's say another. So here we pass a route handler function, which takes two arguments, request and response, and potentially next as well, right? So that goes to this code block. Note that here we're passing a function reference. We are not calling this function. In other words, we don't call it and pass some arguments here. It's the Express framework that calls this function and passes these arguments at runtime. So this is the issue we have. In the current implementation, we are calling async middleware. We are not passing a reference to a function that takes these three parameters. So we need to make a small change in this function. We can keep everything here as is, but when we call this function, we can return a route handler function that looks like this. In other words, this function will be like a factory function. We call it and get a new function. That function is a route handler that looks like this, and Express can call that and pass these arguments at runtime. So here we need to return a route handler function. So that takes a request, response, and next, like this. Now look, here we have access to these objects at runtime. Express is going to pass this for us. So we can move this code inside the body of this function, and then we can simply pass these arguments here, right? So let's cut this and put it here. Now in this function, we are awaiting the call to the handler. So we need to mark the calling function, which is this function, as async. And we no longer need to apply this async here anymore, because in this function, in async middleware, nowhere we are awaiting a promise. We're simply returning an async function, okay? So this is unnecessary. We should delete it. And we're done. Let's see what happens. Let's review. So with the new implementation, we moved the try catch block to a single place. We don't have to repeat it in every route handler. And this means the code in our route handlers will be more focused. We can see the actual logic that belongs to the route handler. And the way we achieve this was by defining this async middleware that takes a handler. So we call this async middleware here, pass our original route handler here. So we're passing a function reference. We call that handler. Now, when we call this function, we return a standard Express route handler. This route handler is an async function with 3 parameters. In the body of this function, we have a try catch block. And in the try block, we simply call the handler that we pass as an argument here. Now, we don't want to have this async middleware hanging in the genres module. We want to put this in a separate module so we can reuse it in multiple places. So in the middleware folder, I'm going to add a new file, async.js. Now back in genres.js, let's cut this code, move it here, and here we simply export this function. Simple as that. Now back in genres.js, on the top, we need to load this module. So const, let's call this async middleware. We set this to require from middleware folder async module. Now with this new implementation, we simply wrap each route handler with this async middleware. So we call async middleware and pass this route handler function as an argument.